For example, in the organisation I worked for, journalists and producers would go backwards and forwards to Israel on junkets. So when I would say, hang on, I've been interviewing an Israeli military spokesperson every night, how about a Palestinian? The response was, they're all mad. What for? They're all crazy. So this is a huge problem. The other, another example are journalists who have very close relationships with spooks, frankly, and they are given access to information that's exclusive. So the other thing I wanted to mention to you is the issue of self-validation is very important, because we seem to behave in the media like sheep. But you have to understand what happens. At the end of the day, everyone sits there and compares newspapers or compares bulletins. You've got, you're in a newsroom and you've got all the television cameras lined up, television sets lined up on different news programs. And at the end of it, everyone pats themselves on the back. We got it right because we all said the same thing. See? And if anyone has dared to lead with a different story, oh, there's great mirth. Oh, look at, how idiotic was that? They missed the main story. Taking a different angle on a story is even worse. So much derision if you don't toe the line. In this environment, we also have a complete demonisation of certain people. We've seen it with Julian Assange, and we've certainly seen it with the Chinese premier and the Russian premier. And I'm not talking about since Russia invaded Ukraine, I'm talking about long before then. Putin was demonised. We have a real problem with communism still, and they're not even communist anymore. So, do we have any power as individuals? Yes, we do. Yes, we do. And an umbrella organisation like IPAN has got even more power. The question is always, what's going to work? How do we do this? And I'd like to talk about the mainstream media and the digital space or social media, because they're not entirely separate today. Let's look at strategies for the mainstream media first. What's always going to work is identifying an opportunity and coming up with a brilliant idea. This doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And when it does come together, it's fantastic. And one example that I can think of is Terry Hicks putting on an orange suit and getting in a cage. And that image was reproduced everywhere, all over the world. He did it in numerous Australian cities. And Stephen Kenny, his lawyer, was telling me that he actually Stephen built the cage, got out his welding gear and knocked it up. So that was, the opportunity was an election coming up that John Howard wanted to win. The brilliant idea was Terry in this cage saying, this is where my son is. This is where people are held who haven't been charged. They're held there for years. They're tortured in a gazillion different ways. And it worked. A second strategy is to identify someone who is going to resonate with the average Australian. What's the average Australian? The average Australian for this exercise has to be someone who's conservative, someone who's part of the establishment class, perhaps. So it has to be someone who's going to appeal, not appeal to us. We're already converted. We already are aware of the situation, and we want to engage others. So we need to be mindful of selecting people who are going to be advocates, or approaching them to ask them to be advocates. When I was on my way here, someone told me a story on the phone about what changed her mind about gay marriage. And it was Ian Thorpe coming out. Because prior to that, she thought, no, hang on, I don't mind them having relationships, but marriage is between a man and a woman. And it was Ian Thorpe talking about what he would be missing out on, what he doesn't want to miss out on, that clicked for her. And it's because he wasn't threatening. And this was articulated to me. It was because he didn't look like one of those gay people. So we have to be mindful about what's going to work. In the case of Julian Assange, it's been a former foreign minister who's been absolutely wonderful. And in each instance, we need to think, who is going to be a good advocate for this cause? It doesn't have to be a politician. It can be a footballer, or it might be an actor, or it might be a singer. Another strategy is, or something we need to be mindful of, is that we can engage with people that we don't necessarily agree with on everything. And to give you a specific example, because I was referring to Bob Carr earlier, I take my hat off to Bob for advocating for Julian. But when I was on the National Human Rights Consultation, Bob buried it. Bob buried the Human Rights Act. Bob and John Hagistigos preceded us everywhere we went. We'd get off a little light plane somewhere and get into a taxi and turn on the radio, and there'd be Bob. He was there before us on the airwaves, telling everybody how terrible the Human Rights Act was going to be. But that was then, and this is now. So I think it's always very important for us to be able to work together with people to shift the needle on a particular issue where we that we can work together with. Another strategy, of course, with the mainstream media, which I'm sure a lot of people do anyway, is write letters to the editor, complain about programs, etc. Write to producers of programs, write to radio hosts. When we do that, though, there is, I know from some of my own followers on Twitter, it's very difficult for people not to express the enormous emotion that's there. And there's a place for that. But when we're criticising mainstream media, it's very, very important to be able to offer some constructive feedback. How about this idea? How about pointing out what was wrong with the story, pointing out the fact that perhaps they always use the same experts. And if we look at Ukraine and China, we know where those experts are coming from. So we need to be able to suggest to them alternative voices. And there are excellent alternative voices in this country and also overseas. and yet we don't see them, we don't hear of them. There's one new voice. There's one new voice in the Australian context that I'm very pleased about, and he's starting to be referred to as an expert, and that's Clinton Fernandez. Now, Clinton's latest book, Sub-Imperial Power, if you haven't read it, I recommend it strongly to you. Is absolutely brilliant. Now, Clinton's an academic and he's been working in the national security space and international relations for a very long time. But we need to hear his alternative view in the mainstream media, and that is starting to happen. But there's a whole list, long lists of people from Douglas. Why don't we hear Douglas McGregor's voice on Australian television? Why don't we have Scott Ritter on Australian television or radio? We don't even have, well, other than 60 Minutes, who spoke to Tony Kevin, we don't draw on local people who have a long history and connection with the country and understand it well. But we tend to use, the mainstream media tends to use the same experts all the time who all sing from the same songbook. And finally, I suppose, where there are funds available, it's really important to engage a professional publicist. And sometimes it's possible to find a publicist who's going to offer their services gratis. And this is because, the reason it's important is because a lot of press releases, we can put out press releases, and a press release with the word peace in it is going to end up in the bin straight away. Publicists not only have current media lists, but they also have developed long-term relationships with producers and journalists. They're very good at placing stories. They're very good at giving exclusives. So I know that perhaps they don't have a very good reputation, but it's a resource that we need to be able to draw on. And there are people out there who are prepared to, to work on a project because they believe in it without necessarily receiving remuneration. I'd like to talk a little bit now about social media. And that's the space that I've been operating in since I've left the mainstream media. For me, it's a far more democratic tool, despite all the propaganda, despite the shadow banning, despite the algorithms, despite all of that. It still has the capacity for us to make connections with people all over the world and within our community here, and to promote a public discourse that we're not going to find on the mainstream media, but that can affect the mainstream media. And that's what I'd like to speak to you about. I haven't operated on Facebook and Instagram and those other platforms because I regarded Twitter as a far better work tool. In fact, Twitter is where, without a doubt, you will learn the news first, and you will find sources of independent journalism. And occasionally I will see something on Twitter and will try and verify it. or try and find an article about it, and there's nothing. There's not even the wire services have put anything out yet. So it is an amazing place to be informed. It's where we see what is done to the Palestinian people on a daily basis. Now, I recall seeing a video of a former Israeli soldier who explained that those raids that occur every night, they haven't received intelligence that there is someone in that household who's likely to be a terrorist. He gives personal testimony to the effect that they do it purely to let them know who's boss, to terrorize them. Now, that sort of material you're not going to find on the mainstream media. So the question is, in this case and in other examples, how do we migrate it across? There are various ways of doing that, and there are some people who do it very effectively on Twitter. One is Kathryn Leckie. Does anyone here follow Kathryn? Yeah. Okay. So Kathryn will respond to a story that the ABC, for example, have just tweeted about and point out where they've really let us down, where the error is or where the bias is, but then also give them the material they need to rectify it. They may not, but if Kathryn does it and you do it and I do it, eventually they're going to say, oh, hang on, you know, the punters, which they like to refer to us as, the punters are getting restless and we better have a look at this. It is about numbers. It's about the number of people who are going to respond and say, no, I'm sorry, it's not good enough because you're ignoring X, Y, Z. Of course, one of the keys is always to be respectful and to provide facts and to provide links to reputable reports or source material and alternative experts. The other thing that Kathryn and others do well is they write threads. So it's not just one tweet, but a series of tweets where you're replying to yourself. But when someone sees that tweet, they will also see all your replies. And so it's like you can tell us a little story. You can have a narrative going and you can have a link in each of the tweets. Unfortunately, on Twitter, we get a lot of trolls and they often come with just a number and a faceless or an avatar or some sort of, nothing. And it's important to remember that they're not worth wasting. Their job is to take up your oxygen, take up your time, waste your time. And it's important to identify when that's happening and just not waste our time. It's also important to have a digital toolbox. And this is very, very important because we really are in a war, a situation of war, and we have no hope of prevailing unless we have the right tools. So what do we need in this arsenal, in this digital toolbox? If we're running an organisation and we're sending out newsletters, and this newsletter will arrive in everybody's inbox, along with about, I don't know, maybe 20, 30, 40 other emails. We need a live button in that email so that they can share it really easily. We need to increase our video material. I noticed a couple of the organisations have their own YouTube channels, but there's very little material there. We need to increase the amount of short clips. So there are some brilliant discussions on YouTube, brilliant discussions that go on for an hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours. But fewer people are going to invest 2 or 3 hours. Many more people are going to invest 3 minutes, 5 minutes, maybe even 20 minutes. So it's important to provide that material in more digestible sizes. Now, in addition to that, we need to have a bank. So in that bank is material that we need to access regularly so that we don't waste our time. For example, a list of articles on specific issues that we consider top-notch, whether it's on multipolar versus unipolar world, whether it's on China or Russia or independent foreign policy, in various, subject categories. We need to remember that we need to be able to access things easily. One of the useful things that I found recently on Twitter was a letter by the Polish ambassador to Ukraine and the Israeli ambassador to Ukraine in 2019 to Zelensky, asking him when is he going to do something about Nazism in his country. Now, for those who believe there is, this Nazism's being hyped up, why would the Polish ambassador to Ukraine and the Israeli ambassador to Ukraine be writing to the president in 2019? So they are very useful documents. So we need source material. For example, there are probably at least half a dozen former CIA agents who have personal testimonies on YouTube. One is Philip A.G., and there are many others. A.G. will tell you that he's a former CIA. They have been operating in Ukraine for decades, many decades. Others will tell you how they plant stories, entirely made up stories. And the purpose of that sometimes is to influence Congress, to get approval for funds. Those testimonies are invaluable, and we need to have them in our toolbox. We need to be able to not only share them personally on our platform, but share them amongst each other so that we're not all duplicating, spending our time doing the same thing. We need a list of independent news sites that we trust, and also news sites that we don't and why we don't. Someone the other day told me how, I'm absolutely wrong about Ukraine and wrong about China, and they get all their information from independent news site, and that independent news site was Bellingcat. Now, yes, but you see, unless you know who funds Bellingcat, unless you know that anything with the word democracy in it is a front for the CIA. Unless you know the National Endowment for Democracy is not what it sounds, not what it's making out that it stands for. You don't know that. So we also need a list of journalists that we trust and that we can recommend to other people, whether it's Glenn Greenwald, Chris Lynn Hedges, Patrick Lawrence, Aaron Mattei, John Pilger. I mean, the list goes on, but we need that tool to help others find what we think they should be reading for an alternative understanding of the mainstream narrative. And the links to personal testimony are extraordinarily important. Watching the collateral murder video on YouTube is one thing, but listening to the testimony of the American soldier who went up to the van and saw the children, the little girl with all the glass in her eye, the little boy had his, big stomach wound. The name of the soldier was Ethan McCord. It's a very powerful testimony. I don't want to take up too much time by talking about that, but if you haven't seen it, do look out for it. The other person is Dean Yates in that story. Dean Yates ran the Reuters office at the time, and it was his employees who were shot. He was told that they don't have that footage, the footage that Julian Assange, that Bradley Manning passed on to Julian Assange. They couldn't find the footage. So he didn't know what the circumstances were that his two employees were killed. He learned how they died when he saw WikiLeaks show it to the world. So listening to Dean Yates tell that story is very important and powerful. I'm going to wrap up because I'm going on for too long, I'm sorry. There are other aspects of using social media that we could talk about, but I'll leave it there. I just want to impress upon you that it's not going to be easy, but it's possible. And we just need more of us having the right tools. Thank you.